So, this is a doozy. Near the end of Culture of Narcissism by Christopher Lasch, there's a chapter entitled The Flight from Feeling, the Sociopsychology of the Sex War. And while a little bit of this is outdated simply because the problems of his day aren't exactly the same as ours, like the rest of the book, there's quite a bit of it that's still very much relevant and doesn't feel like we've really, had that much change. So, like looming in the background, you have to remember that Christopher Lasch is observing great trends that have gone on politically and economically. In this case, he mentions near the beginning of this chapter that capitalism had created the conditions for what turned out to be, more sexual equality, women's liberation, and the subsequent battle of the sexes. It had developed over a long period of time, creating the conditions that, for instance, led to more light labor work being needed. Also, with consumer capitalism, the need for more consumers, the need for people to make more money, had created conditions where the family inevitably was going to change. This wasn't really a choice of either men or women. Women were going to enter the workforce in greater and greater numbers because that much labor was demanded and new and lighter forms of labor and work were demanded. And what happened over time, and I know I've mentioned this before, is women and men both kind of had to work in many cases, in most cases, in order to just get the things that everybody expected or wanted to have. In a lot of cases, an absolute necessity. This led to inevitable changes in the family and shook up expectations between men and women, leading to a, quote, war of the sexes. And that's partly because it happened really rapidly. And this is something that we forget when we think about capitalism. The capitalism is really a very revolutionary force, and it shakes things up, and it continually shakes and changes things. And lots of times, part of the problem is it changes things so rapidly that people, human beings, real people, can't keep up with it. And this was certainly the case in the 1970s as the war of sexes got underway. Not had been underway for couple of decades. Now, he says towards the beginning, and he doesn't mean this, these are quotes that reflect other people's points of view about these changing relationships between men and women. First quote, "The decline of child rearing as a major preoccupation has freed sex from its bondage to procreation and made it possible for people to value erotic life for its own sake." So this was the message of sexual liberation that was going on. Another quote, "The growing determination to live for the moment, whatever it may have done to the relations between parents and children, appears to have established the preconditions of a new intimacy between men and women." So people were talking about how now that there weren't these societal expectations that people had to get married, that men had to do one thing, that women had to do another thing, that we would now be able to have more real intimacy between men and women, both friendship and romantic relationships, because there weren't all these other artificial expectations in the way. Strangely, something similar was promised by communist ideology. That they'd get these weird old-fashioned expectations out of the way, and suddenly men and women would be together because they wanted to be, and therefore the relationships would be much more intimate and equal and better. But of course, Lasch, always the contrarian, says this appearance is an illusion. Under the rhetoric for Lasch, the reality is, what he could see was that the relationships between men and women had not gotten better and more intimate, but had rather gotten more estranged. They'd worsened. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this that he mentions. I picked out some, and again, I avoided the Freudian psychology. I hope you appreciate that. Now, he says the cult of intimacy which came up in a lot of, like movies. I don't actually know when this was made, but I was thinking of this as like the romantic movie par excellence. It's The Lake House. And, the expectation was heightened that men and women would have this intimate romantic relationship. And that became this cult of intimacy in Lasch's view. The overemphasis on intimacy created expectations that real human beings couldn't fill. So he said the cult of intimacy conceals a growing despair of finding it. Personal relations crumble under the emotional weight with which they are burdened. So I think what Lasch is saying is something that really resonates with me, which is that our society, in all of its aspects, including its popular culture, places so much, weight and expectation on the romantic relationship between men and women, especially in marriage, that no relationship is going to be able to measure up in the real world, and the expectations are high, leading to constant disappointments. It's built up in people's minds. Ladies, just think of the articles in the women's magazines, and especially the ones devoted to weddings. And there's just no way that normal human marriages are going to be able to fulfill those expectations. So what happens, and Lasch concurs with this, is, we expect way too much out of this one relationship. In a lot of cases, people start pushing other people out of their lives. Oh no, I don't have any more time for these friendships over here. Can't go bowling, or whatever it was that you did before, right? Because the other person expects you to be there every night, and will get jealous even if you're having, even if you're spending time with somebody of the same sex or opposite sex, depending on what kind of sexuality you have. So, like, even if it's non-threatening sexually, they're still not going to like you to spend a lot of time, because all of the the wonderful fulfillment of life needs to come from this one relationship. The husband inevitably, according to Lasch, is more likely to duck out under these pressures, because they sense that they can't possibly be fulfilled completely by their marriage, and also that the wife is expecting that, and it's kind of overwhelming. And so they escape. So they're more likely to escape. I suppose this was especially true during the 70s and 80s, maybe that the husband in particular would do this. And he said in the wake of that, the wife, more left with the family, the children, smothers attention on the children. We talked about that last time. He thought there was a dynamic going on there with the smothering mother. So he says, under these circumstances, a divorce in which the mother retains custody of her children merely ratifies the existing state of affairs, no pun intended, the effective emotional desertion of his family by the father. Okay, so the father is already absent, starts to duck out of the relationship because these expectations are unfulfillable, and he maybe realizes that there's more to life, and he just wants to escape from this intense scene. And under those circumstances, the divorce has already kind of happened in that marriage, because there never was a real partnership between the man and the woman regarding the sort of nuts and bolts of marriage, which is, I think in Lasch's view, the whole ball of wax is about raising the children and kind of like cooperating with each other and in various aspects of life. Okay, so divorce just sort of ratifies what's already pre-existing. Here are some reasons he lists for the war of the sexes, or as he puts it, the sexual combat of his time, and maybe some of these still apply. Think about this. He says the transformation of capitalism from its paternalistic and familial form, which is the older capitalism where small business, local business, much more prevalent, to managerial, corporate, bureaucratic system of almost total control. So there's a lot more pressure upon people who work in the corporate bureaucratic system to perform on the job, to be a part of the job while off the job. It becomes all consuming. It starts to, make people move hither and yon to do all sorts of things to enhance their commercial capital. So this is a lot of pressure that adds for more tensions generally. Then he lists the collapse of chivalry, which he kind of depicts as this fig leaf that covered the natural tension between men and women and made it easier for both sexes, even though he doesn't endorse chivalry per se, but it did make it easier for both sexes to kind of in effect escape from each other. Men could look at women as a little bit weaker and more in need of help, which they could kind of dive into helping occasionally and treating them with this gentlemanly demeanor. So there was kind of like a code, that they could tap into as far as how they were supposed to act towards women. Women, on the other hand, could see men as other, kind of stronger, their role being to protect women's, to maybe support, but not to expect not to expect all levels of life to be fulfilled by this other person. So I think for Lasch, the code of chivalry represented more generally a code by which you could relate to the sexes, and this is now, he says, missing. It's not that he necessarily wants it back, but now that presents men and women with, well, how then do we relate to each other, right? He lists the liberation of sex from former constraints, and by that he just means that now with effective birth control, with the availability of abortion, with all of these means by which people can regulate their relationships, and now we have the whole online area of life that can kind of do that as well. We don't have to worry about those things anymore. So sex, he says, becomes detached from obligations, right? And from relationships. Maybe sex can become purely recreational. So that's why he lists the pursuit of sexual pleasure as an end in itself. In prior times, I think Lasch thought, it couldn't really be an end in itself because there were so many other consequences that came with it, but at least in our minds, it has been detached. I think Lasch would probably argue it hasn't really been, and this is part of the problem. That underlying sex, there's always relationship expectation, or if there isn't, there's the absence of it. There's the felt absence of it. And this is a more difficult thing to get around than we think. You can't just get around it with birth control. Then he lists again the emotional overloading of personal relationships, already talked about that, and then the irrational male response to the emergence of liberated women. If you never lived anywhere near the 1970s, you might not, but I was a kid during the 1970s, and there was an oversized male reaction to women's liberation. There was an oversized women's liberation, in the sense that women were really being very vociferous. The media was playing that up. There was a huge focus on women's liberation culturally during that decade. And men also reacted in a very outsized way. Either they went for it totally and they became feminists themselves, or they tended to be very balky and rather double down on their sexism and get pretty, pretty resistant. And so men and women butted heads a lot. Lasch says, democracy and feminism have stripped the veil of courtly convention from the subordination of women revealing the sexual antagonisms formerly concealed by the feminine mystique, which is a reference, offhand reference to Betty Friedan's book, great classic, The Feminine Mystique. So, yes, right? Like without those veils, the antagonisms that are always kind of there were revealed and then they were heightened, right? And the expectation then was that men and women would be totally and fully equal. And if they weren't in any way, then that was a cause for continued concern and work and fighting, right? Lasch says sex, valued purely for its own sake, loses all reference to the future and brings no hope of permanent relationships. Sexual liaisons, including marriage, can be terminated at pleasure. Okay, I find that reference to the future really interesting, and the reference to hope. Okay, that's not a point that's usually made. You know, a rather nihilistic view of sex as just detached from relationship, detached from just about anything other than the moment. It does work against hope, right? Because hope is about the future. It's about, you know, various foundations that one might lay down in the future, right? And so the nihilistic nature of sex is heightened by Lasch's remarks here. You know, in a nutshell, women's newfound open interest in performance as a focus intimidated men, right? And he mentions this, like he more than mentions this. This is a big point for Lasch. Women started to talk about sexual performance, theirs and their partners. And this intimidated men. And they became afraid of women. And this became another wall, a barrier between the two. And it removed the romance for women, he points out, because with more attention on performance, there is less romance, right? Because it's not about the unknown and what might happen, but expectations ahead of time about what will happen, okay? And he says at the same time, people's demand from personal relations, I will start over again. And he says, at the same time, people demand from personal relations the richness and intensity of a religious experience. Again, you know, these things are in so much tension that it's obviously inevitable that there will be huge disappointments, that there will be huge tensions as a result. I'll end it with this quote. Towards the end of the chapter, he says, "The younger women rightly think that no one should settle for less than a combination of sex, compassion, and intelligent understanding. The attempt to implement these demands, however, exposes her to repeated disappointments, especially since men appear to find the demand for tenderness as threatening to their emotional security as the demand for sexual satisfaction." Now, was he particularly criticizing men? No. I want to make that clear. He does endorse, to a certain extent, the idea that men and women are just different, okay? That women tend to need one thing out of a relationship and men another. So for Lasch, maybe just dealing with the fact that they're different, and also with the fact that we probably will not be able to get 100% of our emotional and spiritual and whatever fulfillment out of one relationship, whether it's prior to or in marriage, it might help. He doesn't give solutions at the end of this chapter beyond that sort of suggestion. It's a work in progress. And Lasch's chapter just shows us how rocky this period of time has been for relationships, sex, family, and how much, frankly, capitalism has to play in that, right? This isn't necessarily a completely anti-capitalist message. It's just kind of pointing back to the ultimate cause of all this and why these events tend to shake people to their foundation and cause all sorts of conflict. Partly because they happen so quickly and the change is always ongoing. This is an effect of the capitalist system. All right, well, see you next time when I finish up the Culture of Narcissism, and then next we will move on to the Enchantments of Mammon by Eugene McCarraher.